There's a particular moment that happens after you've said yes. Maybe you're still on the phone with the person who asked. Maybe you've just closed the email confirming you'll do the thing. Maybe you're walking away from the conversation where you agreed to help, to attend, to take on one more responsibility you don't actually have time for. And in that moment, there's a sinking feeling in your stomach. A quiet voice that says, "Why did I just agree to that?" Followed immediately by the familiar spiral of regret mixed with resignation. Because you know you'll do it. You always do. But you also know that saying yes just cost you something you can't afford to give. Time you don't have. Energy that's already depleted. Peace of mind that was already fragile. And yet, when the moment came, when someone asked, the word yes came out of your mouth before you even consciously decided. Like a reflex. Like something you don't control. Maybe you know this pattern. Maybe it's you. That person who can't say no even when every fibre of your being is screaming that you should. Who agrees to things you don't want to do, then spends the time leading up to them filled with dread. Who looks at your calendar packed with obligations you volunteered for and wonders how you ended up here again. Who feels simultaneously like the most helpful person everyone knows and the most resentful person alive. Because you're giving and giving and giving, but it doesn't feel like generosity. It feels like compulsion, like something you can't stop doing even though it's slowly draining the life out of you. The yes isn't coming from abundance, it's coming from fear. And the regret that follows, that's the part of you that knows you just betrayed yourself again. Most people think chronic people pleasers are just being nice, just being helpful, just being the kind of person who shows up for others. But psychology tells a far more complex and painful story. For most people who can't say no, the problem isn't generosity, it's terror. The terror of disappointing people, of being seen as selfish, of losing connection, of being rejected or abandoned or deemed not worth keeping around. The yes doesn't come from wanting to help. It comes from believing that your value is conditional. That people will only want you as long as you're useful. That love is something you have to earn through constant availability and endless accommodation. And if you ever say no, if you ever prioritize your needs over someone else's request, that's when they'll leave. That's when they'll realize you're not worth the trouble. That's when you'll be alone. Here's the part that makes self-sufficient people uncomfortable. People who always say yes aren't choosing to be helpful. They're compelled by a nervous system that registers no as dangerous. When someone asks for something and you want to say no, what happens in your body? Your heart rate increases. Your chest tightens. Anxiety floods your system. Your brain is screaming, threat, threat, threat. Not because the request itself is dangerous. Because somewhere deep in your history, saying no led to danger, to anger, to rejection, to love being withdrawn. So your nervous system learned, saying yes keeps you safe, even when yes is destroying you, even when yes means sacrificing your own well-being, even when yes creates resentment so deep you can barely look at the person you just agreed to help. Because resentment, while painful, feels safer than the terror of what might happen if you said no. Think about the last time you said yes and regretted it. What were you actually afraid would happen if you said no? Did you think they'd get angry? Think you were selfish? Stop liking you? Never ask you again? Decide you weren't worth being friends with? Those fears feel real in the moment. Overwhelming. Like if you say no, something terrible will happen. And here's the thing. For many chronic yes-sayers, something terrible did happen. Once, when they were young, when they were vulnerable, when they said no or set a boundary or prioritized themselves, and the response was punishment, withdrawal, rage, abandonment. The message was clear. Your no is not acceptable. Your needs don't matter. Your only value is what you can do for others. And that message? It's still running, still dictating behavior decades later, still making you say yes when everything in you wants to say no. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's built across childhood, usually. The child who learned that saying no to a parent's request meant facing their anger learned that no equals danger. The child who was praised for being helpful but ignored when they needed help themselves learned their value was conditional. The child who watched a parent withdraw love when they were difficult learned that having needs makes you unlovable. Over time, these experiences don't just create beliefs, they create wiring. Neural pathways that make saying yes feel safe and saying no feel like jumping off a cliff. Your conscious mind knows, rationally, that saying no to helping someone move won't end the friendship. But your nervous system, it's responding to old data, to a time when saying no actually was dangerous, when it actually did lead to abandonment. Somewhere along the way, the automatic yes became your identity. You're the helpful one, the reliable one, the one people can always count on. And there's something seductive about that identity. It feels good to be needed, to be appreciated, to be the person people turn to. Except you're not actually being chosen for who you are. You're being chosen for what you do. And deep down, you know the difference. You know that if you stopped saying yes, stopped being available, stopped performing helpfulness, people would drift away. Not because they don't care about you, because the relationship was never really about you. It was about what you provide. And that realization, that's what creates the resentment. Not toward them, really. Toward yourself. For continuing to say yes when you know it's creating a dynamic where you're needed, but not actually known. Here's what researchers discovered about this pattern. Dr. Harriet Braker's work on people-pleasing shows that chronic yes-sayers often experience what's called approval addiction. The temporary relief you feel when someone accepts your yes becomes a hit of validation. Your brain starts craving. Each time you agree to something and the person responds with gratitude or appreciation, your brain gets a small dose of, "You're okay, you're safe, you're valued." But like any addiction, you need more of it to get the same effect. So you say yes more often, take on more responsibilities, make yourself more available. Not because you want to, but because the absence of that approval feels unbearable. Because when you're not actively being helpful, the anxiety creeps back in. The fear that without your usefulness, you're nothing. We live in a culture that rewards people-pleasing, that calls it being a team player or going above and beyond, or being selfless. We celebrate people who sacrifice their own needs for others. We valorize exhaustion as dedication. We treat boundaries as selfishness. So when you're someone who can't say no, the world reinforces your pattern. People benefit from your inability to refuse. They get their needs met. You get exploited. And everyone calls it kindness. Meanwhile, you're drowning. Your calendar is full of obligations you don't want. Your energy is depleted from constantly giving. Your resentment is building, but you can't express it because that would make you the bad person. So you keep saying yes, keep smiling, keep pretending it's fine when internally you're screaming. There's a particular exhaustion that comes with chronic yes-saying. It's not just physical tiredness from doing too much. It's the emotional labour of constantly betraying yourself. Every time you say yes when you mean no, you send yourself a message. Your needs don't matter. Your preferences don't count. Your well-being is secondary to everyone else's convenience. And over time, that message becomes your truth. You stop even knowing what you want because you've spent so long asking what everyone else wants. You lose touch with your own preferences because they've been irrelevant for so long. You become a collection of other people's needs walking around in your body, and the person you actually are is buried so deep you can barely remember them. Behind every automatic yes is often hidden rage, not at the person who asked, at yourself, for not being able to say no, for being so weak, for needing approval so desperately you'll sacrifice yourself to get it, for not having the courage to disappoint people even when saying yes is destroying you. That rage has nowhere to go. You can't express it to the person who asked because they didn't do anything wrong. You can't express it to yourself because that would mean acknowledging the pattern. So it sits there, fermenting, turning into resentment toward people who have no idea you're angry because you agreed to help them. Creating distance in relationships where the other person thinks everything's fine while you're silently keeping score of every time you said yes when you wanted to say no. Here's where it gets painfully complex. Sometimes saying yes actually is the right thing. Sometimes helping is appropriate. Sometimes being there for people you love matters. The problem isn't that you're helpful. It's that you can't choose when to help because you're not actually choosing at all. You're reacting, automatically saying yes because your nervous system won't let you say no. So even when you want to help, even when it genuinely feels good, there's this underlying resentment because it wasn't truly a choice. And you can't tell the difference anymore between authentic generosity and compulsive people-pleasing, between genuine care and fear-based accommodation, between showing up because you want to and showing up because you're terrified of what happens if you don't. The question isn't whether you should say yes or no to any particular request. The question is, are you able to say no? Do you have access to that option? Or does no feel so dangerous, so impossible, that yes is the only response available? If you can't say no, then your yes doesn't mean anything. It's not generosity, it's compulsion. And the people receiving your yes? They often don't know the cost. They think you want to help. They think you offered freely. They have no idea you're dying inside, that you agreed out of terror, that their gratitude is making you feel even more trapped, because now you can't even resent them without feeling guilty. Maybe healing doesn't start with learning to say no. Maybe it starts with understanding why no feels impossible. What are you actually afraid will happen? Write it down. If I say no, they'll think I'm selfish. Okay, and then what? They won't like me. And then? They'll leave. There it is. The core terror. Abandonment, rejection, being deemed not worth keeping. Once you can see the fear, you can start testing whether it's true. What happens when you say no to something small? Does the person actually leave, or do they just say, "Okay, no problem," and move on? Most of the time, the catastrophe you're afraid of doesn't happen, because healthy people accept no. It's only unhealthy people who punish you for having boundaries. And if someone does get angry when you say no, that's information. That tells you the relationship was never safe, that they only wanted you when you were useful. There's something that shifts when you realize the people worth keeping are the ones who can handle your no, the ones who don't need you to be available constantly to value you, the ones who care about your well-being more than your usefulness. Those people? They want you to say no when you need to. They don't want you helping out of obligation. They want authentic connection, which requires you to be honest about your capacity. When you start saying no, and the right people stay, that's when you learn that no doesn't equal abandonment. That boundaries don't destroy relationships. They actually create the space for real ones. Because people can't love the real you if you're too busy pretending to be endlessly available. So if you're someone who always says yes and regrets it, please understand this. You're not weak. You're not broken. You're operating from survival patterns that made sense once. You learned that yes keeps you safe, that no brings danger, and your nervous system is doing what it was trained to do. But those old rules, they don't apply anymore. You're not that powerless child anymore. You're an adult with agency, with the right to have needs, with the value that doesn't depend on constant service. The work isn't learning to say no. The work is learning that you're worthy even when you're not being useful, that you deserve love even when you disappoint people, that your needs matter as much as everyone else's. There will still be moments when yes comes out automatically, when someone asks and your mouth agrees before your brain catches up, when you feel that familiar dread and realize you just did it again. That's okay. That's not failure. That's pattern that's been running for decades. It doesn't disappear overnight, but each time you notice it, you're building awareness. Each time you feel the regret, you're gathering data about what you actually want versus what fear makes you do. And eventually, with practice, you'll create enough space between the request and your response to actually choose. To check in with yourself, to ask, do I actually want to do this, or am I just afraid to say no? And when you can answer that, honestly, everything changes. But there will also come a day when someone asks you for something and you'll say, no. Your voice might shake, your heart might race. The fear will still be there, but you'll say it anyway. And they won't leave. They'll say, okay, thanks for letting me know. And you'll realise the catastrophe you spent your whole life avoiding was never coming. That no is just a word, that boundaries are just information, that the people who love you can handle your limits, and all the years you spent saying yes out of fear will suddenly make sense. You'll realise you were never protecting relationships. You were protecting yourself from a pain that belonged to your past, not your present. And that awareness? That's freedom. Not from helping, from the compulsion to help. Not from caring, from the terror that not caring makes you unlovable. Not from connection, from the belief that connection requires self-abandonment. That's when yes becomes genuine again, when it comes from choice instead of fear, when it means I want to instead of I'm afraid not to. And that yes, that one's worth giving.